Hey y'all. So we're going to talk about voter suppression. Voter suppression is a broad category of things or like strategy that's used to influence the outcome of an election by trying to keep some people from voting, trying to keep less people voting. Often voter suppression targets specific groups. And we'll see, especially in the history of voter suppression, that's often African American people. So after the Civil War, this is sort of the roots of voter suppression in the US, when Black men got the right to vote, a lot of people, especially in the South, were not excited about the former enslaved people that they lived near voting and having power in government. So many Southern leaders created rules like grandfather clauses, which is something that means you can only vote if your grandfather voted. Obviously, you can't vote then if you were Black in this area. Or they do things like literacy tests that said you can only vote if you know how to read. Since many formerly enslaved people didn't have access to education, they again then couldn't vote. And poll taxes. So you have to pay money, pay a tax when you go to the poll to vote. So these were really, really obvious types of voter suppression. It was really clear what these people were doing, these white leaders in Southern governments mostly, who were trying to keep Black people from voting. Obviously, this is not what voter suppression looks like today, but that doesn't mean voter suppression does not exist today. One thing to know when thinking about voter suppression is just that more broadly, like we looked at in the intro, the United States has lower voter participation. When we're thinking about what's going on right now, guys, this is sort of like what is voter suppression, what's going on in your online notebook. So you can pause me if you need to go add to your online notebook. The US has much lower voter participation, many less of the people in the US who can vote, do vote in an average election when you compare the United States to many other countries in Europe and around the world. One of the big reasons for that is that many people in the United States have done things and passed laws in different states that have made voting harder and want to keep making voting harder, at least for some groups of people. So we'll look at some examples of voter suppression by making voting harder, because that's the main way it looks now. There's not like literacy tests or poll taxes, but there's a variety of different ways in which state governments and local governments have made voting harder in a way that disproportionately affects some groups of people based on a variety of things. So one of the most obvious things that someone could do if they want to make it harder for people to vote, especially this year with COVID, is close voting or close polling places. So have less locations that people go in order to vote. At first that sounds like, well, it's a bummer, but not too big of a deal. But in some states, there's evidence that the polling places that have been closed overwhelmingly in neighborhoods where there's a lot of Black and Latino people, and less likely to be closed in areas where there's a lot of white people. So it's definitely affecting one party, in this case, the Democratic Party voters and people of certain races more than other people. Think about what happens if polling places are closed. One of the huge things that happens is that people have to travel further in some cases. Or if the voting places that are still open, the polling places that are still open, there's sometimes really long lines, like we see in this picture. So people have to wait a really long time to cast their vote. And if you have to wait a really long time, a lot of people are like, doesn't matter. I'm not going to bother to wait in line. Some people stand in line and do it anyway, which is not really fair or like a very pleasant experience. But other people might just give up and choose not to vote. Another thing that similarly affects people is limiting early voting. So in many states, especially because voting is on a Tuesday, right? They allow you to vote early. So there's other days before election day where voting places are open and where you can go and cast your vote. So that on election day, you're like, I'm good, I already voted. In the last several years, a variety of states cut early voting, either like making it less days or making it getting rid of it entirely in a few cases. And again, this has a similar effect. It leads to longer lines and often fewer voters. This, in North Carolina in particular, we looked at a huge percentage of Black voters in North Carolina, 70% of Black voters voted early. So the early voting was thought to affect Black voters in North Carolina more than other groups. So if then they can't vote early and lines are longer, they may choose not to vote, or it's just a worse, harder experience. Okay, so this is one way of suppressing votes, by making it harder to vote by closing polling places. And so this is the problem, right? This is all in what's the problem. By closing polling places, by getting rid of early voting, by making it harder to register as a voter. Those are all ways that can affect voter suppression. But now we're going to focus on one other big way, because this is something that's been common and you may have even heard of in the news over the last couple of years. This form of voter suppression doesn't sound like voter suppression at first, like a lot of these things, and it's known as voter ID laws. Voter ID laws say that in order to vote, you have to show a specific kind of ID at your polling place. So in particular, it's an ID that has a picture and an address on it in many states. So overwhelmingly, the IDs that fit that requirement are driver's licenses and passports, right? So what's the problem with that? The people who are passing these laws say that these laws are going to help prevent voter fraud, prevent people from voting under names that aren't theirs or voting when they shouldn't be voting. But there's very little evidence of voter fraud. What there is evidence of is that many people do not have a government-issued photo ID with their address on it. And across the country, it's about 1 in 10 do not have a government-related ID. Among African-American voters, it's about 1 in 4 who do not have a government-issued photo ID. So why is that? Part of it is to do with where people live, right? So if you live in a city, a lot of people, I don't drive in the city, right? You guys live in Brooklyn, so more of you maybe drive, but still a lot of people don't drive at all. I live in Manhattan. I don't drive at all in the city, really. I don't need to because I can take the train. So one of the big kinds of IDs people have to vote, if they have a voter ID law, is a driver's license. But if you live in a city, you are much less likely to have a driver's license. So this makes it so that it's harder even for people who want to vote. If they don't have the right kind of ID, it can be really hard for them to cast their vote. They can be turned away or told they have to come back in order to show an ID later on. And this is affecting disproportionately poor people, people who live in cities, and African-American people. Oh, and Native American people who often don't have traditional driver's license and whose licenses often don't have the address written on, because the way that reservations are set up, where American Indian people live, they often don't have their address on their card, so they're also really affected by these laws. In New York, these laws aren't on the books, but in many other states they are. So all of these things make it harder for people to vote, especially some groups of people. That's why they're examples of voter suppression. And that's why they're a problem for people who believe that everyone should have the opportunity to vote and voting shouldn't be too hard for people. So now we're in the final part of your online notebook. How do we fix it? And the main way that we fix it is we make it easier to vote. We keep places from passing voter ID laws, for example, or we expand access to early voting. So we say people can vote before election day in addition to election day, so that you don't have to just make it on the day of the election. Another huge thing that we could do is expand voter registration. So you can't vote unless you're registered to vote in the United States. And in many states, you have to register to vote way before the election, or you have to register to vote and it's kind of hard to do so online. So you have to go in person to the DMV where you get your driver's license. Again, it's a barrier that many countries don't have. We could get rid of, we could have automatic voter registration, make it easier for people to be registered to vote, could make it easier for people to vote by allowing them to do early voting. We could have, especially this year with coronavirus, we could have expanded access to mail-in voting, which some states have. Maybe some of your parents maybe mailed in their ballots. Some states don't really have access to mail-in voting or have very limited access to mail-in voting. Or we could get rid of the requirements or voter ID laws that are making it hard for some people to vote in their state. Okay, so make sure to complete your online notebook now, and you'll be ready to share out with your your classmates who studied the other topics.